I've lived in Desert Bloom Estates, a gated golf community outside Scottsdale, Arizona, for 22 years, in a development where the CC&Rs banned short-term rentals in plain, unambiguous language, written back in 1998. Then, 4 months ago, the couple who bought the casita 2 doors down converted it into a nightly rental running strangers in and out of our shared parking court around the clock. And when I called the HOA to complain, I was told, politely, that their unit held a documented legacy exemption. No such exemption had ever appeared on any board agenda I'd sat through in 2 decades on our community's architectural committee. It took me 11 weeks to find out where that exemption actually came from. By the time I did, I understood that the nightly rental 2 doors down was the smallest part of what was happening to this community. My name is Louise Farnsworth. I'm 66, a retired civil engineer, and I've lived at Desert Bloom Estates since 2004, the year my husband Gerald and I sold our place in Tempe and moved out here chasing a golf course view and a quieter kind of retirement than either of us actually got. Gerald passed 6 years ago, but I've stayed. This community, whatever its faults, is genuinely home to me now. And I wasn't about to give up a house I'd spent 2 decades making mine just because the neighborhood had started changing in ways I didn't like. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer for the city of Tempe before I retired, most of it in the Public Works Department, reviewing drainage plans and easement documentation for new subdivisions, which is a duller way of saying I spent 3 decades reading exactly the kind of recorded documents most homeowners never look at twice. Gerald used to tease me that I was the only woman he knew who read deed restrictions the way other people read mystery novels, trying to guess how the story would end before she got to the last page. I didn't think that habit would ever matter much in retirement. It turned out to matter more here than it ever had at the city. Our son Mitchell lives in Denver now with his own family, and he calls most Sundays, usually to ask whether I've finally taken up the pickleball everyone else in this community seems to have adopted with a kind of religious devotion. I haven't, though I'll admit, the 4 courts they put in near the clubhouse in 2019 have done more for this community's social life than anything else Halcyon Properties ever built here, golf course included. Desert Bloom Estates sits on 340 acres of what used to be raw desert scrub before a developer named Halcyon Properties carved it into 512 home sites around an 18-hole golf course in the mid-1990s. It's a gated community in the fullest sense. A manned entry gate, a homeowners association with real teeth, and a set of covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC&Rs, in the language everyone here eventually learns to use, that run to 60-some pages and cover everything from paint colors to what kind of desert landscaping counts as acceptable xeriscaping. Section 7.4 of those CC&Rs, recorded with Maricopa County back in 1998, and never once amended since, states plainly that no home site shall be rented or leased for any period of less than 30 consecutive days, a restriction the developer put in specifically to keep the community residential, rather than letting it drift into a vacation rental district the way parts of Scottsdale eventually did. I've served on the community's architectural review committee for 19 of my 22 years here, a volunteer position that mostly involves approving paint swatches and the occasional pergola application, but it also meant I sat through enough board meetings over 2 decades to know the CC&Rs about as well as anybody in this community who isn't an attorney. I'd known Section 7.4 the way you know a rule you've simply never had reason to test. True, occasionally cited when somebody's adult child tried to sublet a casita for a semester. Never something I expected to have to defend against an actual organized effort to route around it. My mornings out here follow a pattern I've come to genuinely love, retirement or not. I'm up by 6, coffee on the back patio watching the light come up over the Superstition Mountains, and a walk around the community's interior loop road, most mornings before it gets too hot, which by June means before 7. I know most of my neighbors by name, or did, before turnover in the community picked up over the last 5 years, as some of the original 1990s buyers, myself included, started aging out and selling to a mix of retirees and, increasingly, investors who'd never once set foot on the property before closing. The casita 2 doors down from mine, a modest 2-bedroom on a shared parking court that serves my house and 3 others, had belonged to a retired schoolteacher named Hazel Prentice for as long as I'd lived here, until Hazel's health finally required assisted living, and her children sold the place in the spring. It closed in June, to a couple in their late 30s named Trent and Ashley Merrow, who told the handful of neighbors who introduced themselves that they'd bought it as a flexible investment property, a phrase that, in retrospect, should have told me everything I needed to know, though at the time, I took it to mean they'd rent it out long-term to a tenant, same as a few other investor-owned units in the community already did within the CC&R's rules. The shared parking court behind our 4 units is a detail that matters for everything that follows, and it's the kind of thing I understood the way you understand a fact you've simply never had to defend before a stranger. When Halcyon Properties platted this section of the community, 4 casitas were built around a common parking court rather than individual driveways, a design choice that saved the developer money on grading a steep parcel and that came with a recorded easement attached to all 4 deeds, granting each unit's owner and their invited guests the right to use the shared court, explicitly capped at no more than 2 vehicles per unit at any time absent written consent of the other 3 owners. It's the kind of provision nobody thinks about until somebody starts treating that shared court like a hotel loading zone. The other 2 households sharing that court, a retired dentist named Otis Fenley, no relation to the Otis Fenley who'd later stand up at our community meeting. Another one of those small world coincidences Arizona retirement communities seem to specialize in, and a younger couple who both still commuted into Scottsdale for work, had lived alongside Hazel Prentice and me for years, without a single dispute over parking, mostly because none of us had ever needed more than our own 2 spaces in 19 years. I mention that only because it's relevant to how quickly things changed once a 5th household's worth of rotating guests started treating the court as their own. The golf course itself deserves a word, since it's the reason most of us moved here in the first place, and, indirectly, the reason the community's finances have always run a little differently than a typical subdivision HOA. Halcyon Properties dissolved as a company back in 2003, not long after finishing the last phase of construction, which meant Desert Bloom Estates has been entirely self-governed since before I even moved in, with the golf course itself owned and operated by the Homeowners Association rather than a separate country club entity, the way some comparable communities structure it. That arrangement has real advantages: no separate membership fees, no outside club board to negotiate with, but it also means the HOA's finances have always carried more weight and more complexity than most people account for when they buy a retirement house, expecting nothing more complicated than mowing schedules and pool hours. I noticed the pattern before I understood what it was. Starting in late June, roughly 2 weeks after the Merrows closed, cars I didn't recognize began appearing in the shared parking court on a rotating basis, sometimes 2 nights running, sometimes just 1. Always different plates, always different faces, unloading suitcases at odd hours. I assumed, generously, that they were hosting a steady stream of family visiting from out of town, the kind of thing you don't think twice about with new neighbors settling in. By the 3rd week of July, the pattern had become impossible to explain away. A key lockbox appeared bolted to the casita's front gate post, the kind used by short-term rental platforms for keyless check-in. A cleaning service began arriving most mornings around 10, stripping linens and hauling out trash between guest turnovers. And the parking court, designed for a maximum of 8 vehicles across 4 units, regularly held 5 or 6 cars belonging to whatever group happened to be checked in that week, on top of my own car and my neighbors' vehicles, leaving barely enough room to maneuver. The retired dentist, Otis Fenley, mentioned it to me first, catching me on my morning walk in late July. "I had to back out 3 times this morning, just to get my car turned around," he said. "Never had to do that once in 15 years living on that court." I told him I'd noticed the same thing, and intended to say something. He seemed relieved somebody else had clocked it too, though neither of us yet understood how far the problem actually reached beyond our own inconvenience, getting to work and back. I looked up the property listing the Merrows had used to advertise the casita, out of the same instinct that made me pull deed records at the city for 31 years, and found it running under a name that made no reference to Desert Bloom Estates at all, listed instead as Private Golf Villa Retreat, Scottsdale area, with photographs of the shared parking court cropped tightly enough that a prospective guest would have no way of knowing 4 other households depended on that same stretch of asphalt. I should say something here about why I didn't just call code enforcement or the sheriff's office and let somebody else handle it, since more than one neighbor asked me exactly that in the weeks that followed. Short-term rental disputes inside a private, gated HOA rarely fall under county code enforcement the way a zoning violation on an ungated street would. Desert Bloom Estates is legally structured as a private community governed by its own recorded covenants, which means enforcement runs through the association itself, or through the same civil courts and state administrative bodies that handle any other contract dispute. Calling the sheriff about a noisy rental would have gotten a patrol car out for a night, maybe, and nothing more. Fixing this meant going through the actual paperwork, which is exactly the terrain I'd spent 3 decades learning to walk. I introduced myself to Ashley Merrow directly the first week of August, catching her on the shared court while she was resetting the lockbox code for an incoming group. "I don't think we've properly met," I said. "I'm Louise. I'm 2 doors down. I couldn't help but notice you've got guests rotating through pretty regularly." "Oh yes, we've been doing really well with it," Ashley said, with the easy pride of someone who assumed this was simply good news to share. "We're averaging almost full occupancy since July. It's honestly been a great investment." "I have to ask," I said, "because I've served on our architectural committee for a long time, and I know our CC&Rs pretty well. Are you aware Section 7.4 restricts rentals to a 30-day minimum? What you're describing sounds like nightly turnover." Ashley's expression shifted, not quite defensive, more the particular confidence of someone who'd already prepared for this exact question. "We actually looked into that very carefully before we started," she said. "Our unit has a documented legacy exemption from that restriction. It predates the current rental rule. Our real estate agent handled all of it before closing." "A legacy exemption from a rule recorded in 1998, I said. "That would make it older than most of the paint colors this community's approved since I've been on the architectural committee. I'd genuinely like to see it, if you don't mind sharing." "I don't actually have the paperwork on hand," Ashley said. "It's all through the HOA's files. You'd have to ask them directly." She said this with the specific, practiced ease of someone repeating a line she'd been given, rather than one she'd verified herself, though I didn't fully appreciate that distinction until several weeks later. Violation. I want to be honest that I didn't quite believe her in the moment, mostly because 19 years on the architectural committee had taught me that no such exemption had ever crossed my desk, but I also knew better than to argue property law on a driveway with somebody I'd met 4 minutes earlier. I told her I'd look into it through the proper channels and left it there. I called the HOA's management office the following Monday and spoke with an administrative assistant who pulled the Merrow's file and confirmed, reading directly from a note in the account, that Unit 214 carried what the file described as a board-approved legacy rental exemption, granted March of this year. I asked to see the board resolution or meeting minutes reflecting that approval. She told me she'd need to check with the community manager and call me back. She never called back. I called again 4 days later and was told the community manager, a woman named Beverly Colquitt, who also happened to serve as the HOA board's president, was reviewing the request and would follow up directly. I want to note, because it matters later, that having the same person hold both the paid management role and the elected board presidency isn't typical for a community this size, and it was a detail I'd noticed with mild unease over the previous year, without ever connecting it to anything specific. I finally reached Beverly by phone the following week. "I understand your concern, Louise," she told me, in the tone of someone who'd rehearsed the sentence. "But that exemption was properly documented and approved. I can't share the specific board record with an individual homeowner outside of a formal records request, but I can assure you it's legitimate." "I've sat on the architectural committee for 19 years, I said. "I attend most board meetings. I don't recall a vote on any legacy exemption this year, for this unit or any other." "Not every board decision requires a vote at a general meeting," Beverly said. "Some administrative determinations fall within management's discretion under the CC&R's General Authority Clause." I asked Beverly one more direct question before hanging up that call. mostly out of the same instinct that used to make me push back on a contractor's drainage plan when the numbers didn't add up. "Can you at least tell me which board members voted on this administrative determination?" I asked. "Even without seeing the full record, I'd like to know who to talk to about it." Beverly told me the determination had been made within management's operational authority and didn't require an individual board vote at all, a claim that, on its face, contradicted her earlier statement that the board had approved it, though she moved past the inconsistency quickly enough that I didn't catch it until I reread my own notes from the call later that night. That answer struck me as thin even before I went back and reread Section 7.4 myself that evening, along with the general authority clause Beverly had referenced, which grants the board discretion over administrative interpretation of ambiguous provisions, a clause that, on any honest reading, has nothing to do with waiving an unambiguous 30-day minimum for one specific unit. I spent that same evening pulling my own copies of every board meeting agenda from the past 18 months, which I'd kept, out of old engineering habit, in a binder on my office shelf since the day I joined the architectural committee. Nothing in any of those agendas mentioned a legacy exemption program, a rental policy review, or anything resembling the kind of administrative determination Beverly was now describing after the fact. Either the board had discussed and decided something without ever putting it on a public agenda, which itself would violate the community's own bylaws, or the exemption had never actually gone through any board process at all. Warning: ignored. I filed a formal written CC&R complaint the following week, citing both the rental restriction violation and the parking court overuse, and requested, in writing, the actual board documentation supporting the claimed exemption. Arizona law requires homeowners associations to maintain and produce official records, including board resolutions, upon a member's written request within a defined response period, a right I'd used exactly once before in 2 decades, over an unrelated landscaping dispute in 2011. The HOA's 30-day response deadline came and went, without the requested board resolution ever materializing. What I received instead was a letter from Beverly, on HOA letterhead, stating that the exemption documentation is maintained in the community's management files and is not subject to individual member disclosure under the association's records policy. I brought the letter to Trent Merrow directly, catching him at the mailbox kiosk near the entry gate. "Your management company won't produce the board record for your exemption," I told him. "That's not a small thing. Either it exists and they're stonewalling a legitimate records request, or it doesn't exist. Look, we did everything by the book on our end," Trent said. "Our closing agent told us the unit qualified. We paid a transfer fee to the HOA specifically to activate the exemption. I've got the receipt if you want to see it." That detail, a transfer fee paid specifically to activate a rental exemption, was the first piece of information that told me this was bigger than one couple bending a rule. "What was the fee?" I asked. $8,000, Trent said, with no apparent hesitation about sharing the number. "Steep, but it made the investment math work out fine, given what we're pulling in nightly." I asked him who at the HOA he'd actually paid, hoping to understand whether this had gone through any normal channel at all. "Beverly handled it personally," Trent said. "Our closing agent said she was the one to talk to about expediting any rental approval. Seemed pretty routine on her end, honestly. She didn't act like it was anything out of the ordinary." That detail sat with me longer than anything else Trent said that afternoon. A community management office of Desert Bloom's size normally routes any exception request through a documented approval process involving at minimum a paper trail between the applicant, the office, and the board. Hearing that Beverly had handled it personally, with no committee review, and apparently no hesitation on her part, told me this wasn't a one-time favor extended to a confused new buyer. It sounded, even then, like a process Beverly had run before. I want to be honest about why I didn't simply sue the HOA the week I learned about the $8,000 fee. A lawsuit against a homeowners association, even with a strong CC&R violation on my side, typically runs well into 5 figures in attorney fees, once you account for the association's own counsel dragging things out, and takes the better part of a year before a judge issues anything binding. What I needed first was documentation solid enough to make a legal fight unnecessary, or at least much shorter. And Arizona's own Homeowners Association statute gave me a faster route: a formal complaint to the state's Department of Real Estate, which maintains an administrative process specifically for HOA governance disputes, self-representable, and considerably faster than circuit court. I retained an attorney anyway, on limited scope, a sharp property law specialist out of Scottsdale named Harriet Blodgett, mostly to make sure my records request and administrative complaint were drafted correctly. Arizona's HOA statute is unusually strong on records access compared to a lot of states, she told me during our first call. If they've genuinely refused a proper written request for a board resolution twice now, that's a separate statutory violation on top of whatever they're actually hiding. That gives us 2 angles instead of 1. Harriet drafted a second, more formally worded records request, citing the specific statutory provision requiring production, with a shorter compliance deadline and a clear statement that failure to comply would result in an administrative complaint. We sent it by certified mail in early September. Here's the micro setback. 2 weeks later, rather than producing the requested board resolution, Beverly's office sent a letter announcing that the board had voted at what it described as a properly noticed special session to formally ratify and expand the Legacy Exemption program, retroactively covering Unit 214, and, going forward, any unit whose owner paid what the letter now called a flexible use administrative fee. I hadn't received notice of any special session, and when I checked with 3 other longtime residents who normally attended every meeting, none of them had either. I called Wallace Osgathorpe, a board member I didn't yet know, well beyond nodding to him at the mailbox kiosk, mostly to ask whether he remembered any special session being noticed that September. I'd have gotten a notice by certified mail, same as always, he told me. I didn't get one. I didn't even know there'd been a meeting until your letter mentioned it. That call, brief as it was, planted the first seed of what would eventually become a genuine partnership, though neither of us had any idea yet how far it would end up going. Harriet's read on the letter was blunt. This isn't a defense, she told me. This is them trying to paper over the original violation by manufacturing a broader policy after the fact, and doing it through a meeting that, if it happened at all, almost certainly violated Arizona's open meeting notice requirements for HOA boards. If anything, they've just handed us a second, cleaner violation to work with. Desmond Faraday, the community's longtime handyman, agreed to keep the vehicle count log after I explained what was happening, mostly because he serviced the shared court's landscaping irrigation lines twice a week and was already out there regularly enough that nobody would think twice about him jotting down license plates. Over 6 weeks, his log documented 11 separate guest turnovers, 3 separate weeks where the court held 6 or more vehicles at once, and 2 occasions where my own car was blocked in entirely by a rental guest's SUV parked across 2 spaces. I've fixed sprinkler heads at that court for 12 years, Desmond told me the day he handed over the completed log. Never once had to work around this much traffic before this summer. We filed the formal complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate's Office of Administrative Hearings in late September, citing the original CC&R violation, the parking easement overuse documented through Desmond's log, and the records access violations, alongside a request for an expedited hearing, given the ongoing nature of the harm. Mini justice. The administrative hearing, held in Phoenix in late October, before a hearing officer named Renata Osamwegi, lasted a single afternoon. Beverly's own attorney struggled to produce any documentation of the claimed March exemption or the September special session beyond a single unsigned memo, and Harriet's cross-examination established, through Beverly's own testimony, that the flexible use administrative fee had never been formally adopted as an amendment to the recorded CC&Rs, meaning it carried no legal authority to override Section 7.4, regardless of any board vote. Officer Osamwegi's ruling found the Merrow's rental operation in clear violation of the recorded CC&Rs, ordered it discontinued within 15 days, and separately found the HOA's management office in violation of the state's records access requirements, imposing a statutory penalty and ordering full documentation of the community's rental exemption history to be produced within 30 days. The ruling itself ran 9 pages, and I read every word of it twice the night it arrived, partly out of relief and partly out of the same habit that made me read every drainage report twice before signing off on it at the city. Officer Osamwegi had written, in language plainer than most legal findings I'd ever encountered, that an association's management office may not manufacture administrative authority after the fact to excuse a pre-existing violation of an unambiguous recorded covenant, a sentence Harriet told me she intended to cite in any future filing this case produced, not realizing at the time just how soon she'd need to. The Marrows weren't gracious about it. "We're out $8,000 in a rental business we built in good faith," Trent told me the week the cease and desist notice went up on their gate post. "I hope you're happy." "I didn't want you to lose money," I told him. "I wanted a rule that's been on the books since 1998 to actually mean something. You paid $8,000 for an exemption that never legally existed. That's not my doing." I assumed, walking away from that hearing, that this was largely the end of it. A rule enforced, a records violation penalized, one nightly rental shut down. I was wrong. And it was the 30-day document production the hearing officer had ordered that showed me exactly how wrong. Harriet called me the afternoon the production deadline hit, and I could tell from her voice before she said a word that whatever had come through wasn't the tidy conclusion either of us had expected. "I want you sitting down for this one," she said, which is not typically how an attorney opens a call about a routine document compliance deadline. The documents Beverly's office was finally forced to produce showed that Unit 214 wasn't the only casita carrying a flexible use administrative fee exemption. 11 other units across the community had paid the identical $8,000 fee over the previous 14 months, all processed personally by Beverly, rather than through any documented board vote. And every single one of those 11 units had been sold, within the prior year, to entities registered at the same Scottsdale mailing address, a company called Suncrest Hospitality Group. I sat with that 30-day production folder alone for a night before calling anyone, mostly because I needed a few hours to understand what I was actually looking at before I tried to explain it to Harriet, Wallace, or anyone else. 11 exemption approvals, each one identical in structure, each one processed by the same person, each one tied to a unit that had changed hands within the same rough window of time. I'd spent 31 years reading documents for the city of Tempe, looking for exactly this kind of pattern, the kind that looks like coincidence until you line up 3 or 4 instances side by side, at which point it stops looking like anything except a system somebody built on purpose. Harriet pulled the corporate filings behind Suncrest Hospitality Group the same week, and what she found reframed everything I thought I understood about the last 4 months. Suncrest wasn't a collection of individual investors who happened to like our community. It was a single hospitality investment fund that had spent 14 months quietly acquiring casitas throughout Desert Bloom Estates, always through small LLCs registered to obscure the pattern from casual observers, always converting each unit to nightly rental use within weeks of closing, and always paying Beverly's office the same $8,000 administrative fee to unlock an exemption that, as the hearing officer had already found, never had any actual legal basis. "Look at the acquisition dates against your own complaint timeline," Harriet told me, spreading the corporate records across her conference table. "The first Suncrest purchase closed 14 months ago, 3 weeks before the exemption program apparently started appearing in the management system. That's not a coincidence of timing. That's a program built specifically to serve one buyer, disguised well enough that it took a homeowner with your particular background to ever notice the pattern at all. I drove to see Desmond Faraday, the community handyman whose vehicle count log had helped my original complaint, mostly because Desmond fixes things in half the units in this community and tends to hear about ownership changes before anyone posts a for sale sign. He confirmed something I hadn't fully pieced together. A real estate broker working closely with Suncrest had approached at least 6 longtime owners over the past year, offering what Desmond described as aggressive, fast cash purchase prices, specifically for units bordering the golf course, with an unusual amount of pressure to close quickly and quietly. "I figured they just liked the neighborhood," Desmond told me. "Didn't occur to me somebody was buying up a whole rental empire $8,000 at a time, with the HOA's own president cutting the checks loose." Desmond mentioned one detail almost as an afterthought that turned out to matter more than either of us realized at the time. The broker working for Suncrest had, on at least 2 occasions, mentioned Beverly by name to sellers, as someone who could smooth over any HOA paperwork once a sale closed. A phrase Desmond hadn't thought twice about, until I explained what that paperwork had actually turned out to mean. I spent a full weekend after that conversation, laying out a timeline on my dining room table, the old-fashioned way. Index cards and a ball of string. The same method I'd used more than once at the city, when a drainage dispute involved enough overlapping permits and property transfers that a spreadsheet alone couldn't make the pattern visible. 11 acquisitions, 11 exemption fees, 11 consulting-style payments I hadn't yet fully documented but suspected were coming. Gerald would have laughed at the string, I think, though he'd have understood exactly why I needed to see it laid out in front of me before I trusted my own read on it. Beverly Colquitt had held the dual role of elected board president and paid community manager for 6 years, an arrangement the community's original CC&Rs technically permitted, since Desert Bloom Estates was built at a scale where self-management by a resident board member was common in the 1990s, long before most communities this size shifted to fully outsourced third-party management firms. Nobody, in 6 years, had ever needed to test what happens when that dual role stops serving the community and starts serving somebody else entirely. I want to answer plainly why Beverly believed she could run this scheme inside a community of 512 households for over a year, without anyone connecting the pattern. The honest answer is that Desert Bloom Estates, like a lot of aging gated communities built by a developer who's long since dissolved, had drifted into exactly the kind of loose, low-scrutiny governance that makes this kind of scheme possible. An aging resident population less inclined to attend every meeting, a records request process nobody had ever needed to actually use before my complaint, and a management structure where the same person controlling the books also controlled which records anyone ever saw. Beverly had come to Desert Bloom Estates in a way that, in hindsight, gave her an unusual head start on understanding exactly how loosely this community was actually governed. She'd worked for 11 years at a regional property management firm before buying her own casita here, and eventually running for the board, meaning she understood the mechanics of HOA administration at a level most volunteer board members, myself included, never fully developed. Wallace told me later that the community had actually been grateful at the time to have someone with real professional experience willing to take on the unpaid board presidency, which made the eventual arrangement, the board voting, early in her tenure, to formalize her role by also compensating her as community manager, feel at the time like simple pragmatism rather than the structural vulnerability it eventually became. Violation. The full financial picture, once Harriet and I worked through the 30-day document production alongside a broader records request for the HOA's bank statements, was considerably worse than 11 exemption fees. Beverly's management contract, it turned out, included an undisclosed side agreement with Suncrest Hospitality Group, structured as a community liaison consulting fee, paying her an additional $4,000 for every unit Suncrest successfully acquired within Desert Bloom Estates, a direct financial incentive, hidden from the board and membership, for Beverly to facilitate exactly the kind of acquisitions and rental exemptions she'd spent the prior year quietly approving. I read through 11 months of bank statements with Harriet at her office one afternoon, watching a pattern emerge that felt almost clinical in its regularity. A Suncrest acquisition closing, followed within days by an $8,000 exemption fee deposit, followed within a further week by a consulting fee wire to an account in Beverly's name. "This isn't ambiguous anymore," Harriet told me. "This is a board president being paid, personally, to help a single company convert a homeowner's community into a rental portfolio, while telling everyone else the exemptions were legitimate governance decisions." Harriet pulled one more thread that afternoon that I hadn't expected. Beverly's consulting agreement with Suncrest, buried in an appendix to a broader vendor services contract nobody on the board had apparently reviewed line by line in years, contained language explicitly requiring her to facilitate expedited administrative approvals for clients' acquired properties within the community. Language that, read plainly, described exactly the exemption scheme in language a court would have little trouble interpreting. Whoever drafted this, Assumed nobody would ever read this appendix that closely, Harriet said. That assumption held for 14 months. It just didn't hold forever. I brought the bank statement pattern to the community's 2 other elected board members, both of whom, to their credit, seemed genuinely unaware of the Suncrest consulting arrangement. One of them, a retired pharmacist named Wallace Osgathorpe, who'd served alongside Beverly for 4 years, put it about as plainly as anyone did that whole month. I signed off on plenty of things Beverly brought to us as routine administrative matters, he said. I never once saw a dollar figure tied to her name in any of it. If I had, I'd have called it exactly what it is. Wallace and I spent the better part of an afternoon at his kitchen table, going through 4 years of board packets he'd kept in a filing cabinet, cross-referencing them against the Suncrest acquisition dates Harriet had pulled from county records. The pattern held for every single transaction. A Suncrest LLC would close on a unit, and within an average of 9 days, that unit's rental exemption would appear in the management system without ever once surfacing in a board packet Wallace had actually seen. 9 days, Wallace said, staring at his own handwriting from meetings he now clearly wished he'd questioned more closely. She had this running like clockwork, and never once let any of it cross my desk. The third board member, a semi-retired accountant named Priscilla Nakamura, who split her time between Desert Bloom and a condo in San Diego, took the news harder than Wallace did, mostly because she'd personally signed off on the annual budget presentations Beverly gave each January. Budgets that Priscilla now realized had quietly folded the exemption fee revenue into a line item labeled simply miscellaneous administrative income, rather than disclosing its source. I asked about that line item 2 years running, Priscilla told me, visibly angry with herself rather than with me. She told me it was processing fees from routine paperwork requests. I believed her because I had no reason not to. That's exactly the problem, isn't it? She was betting on exactly that kind of trust holding. Warning, ignored. I requested Beverly's resignation directly at the next general board meeting, laying out the exemption pattern and the newly discovered consulting fee arrangement in front of roughly 90 residents who'd turned out once word of the hearing officer's ruling had spread through the community. Every fee was disclosed appropriately within the association's normal financial reporting, Beverly said, reading from prepared notes rather than answering the specific question in front of her. My relationship with Suncrest as a consultant is entirely separate from my duties as board president. There's no legal requirement that I disclose outside business relationships that don't directly conflict with my HOA responsibilities. You were paid $4,000 for every unit a single company acquired in this community, while personally approving rental exemptions that made those units more valuable to that same company, I said. That's the textbook definition of a conflict of interest. I don't need a law degree to see it, and neither does anyone else in this room. I've served this community for 6 years, Beverly said, her tone hardening. I've kept assessments low, kept the golf course solvent, and brought real investment interest into a neighborhood that was otherwise aging out. If a handful of owners want to make this about optics rather than results, that's their prerogative. But I'm not resigning over a consulting arrangement that never once broke any rule I was bound by. Beverly's attorney tried a different tack partway through that same meeting, suggesting that the association's insurance carrier might refuse to cover any legal exposure arising from a contract termination pursued without proper cause, an argument clearly aimed at frightening the room into caution, rather than addressing the underlying conduct. Harriet answered that one too, calmly, noting that the association's insurance policy explicitly excluded coverage for claims arising from a manager's own undisclosed self-dealing, which meant the real financial exposure ran the other direction, toward continuing to employ someone whose conduct the policy wouldn't even protect the community against. A murmur went through the room at that, the specific kind of murmur that told me the meeting had quietly tipped. A longtime resident near the back of the room, a widower named Fritz Camarillo, who rarely spoke at meetings, raised his hand and asked the only question that seemed to matter at that moment. Did the rest of the board know about this consulting fee when they voted to keep renewing your management contract every year? Beverly's attorney tried to answer on her behalf, citing attorney-client considerations, but the silence that followed before anyone actually answered the question directly told the room most of what it needed to know. Her closing comment that evening became the one that finally turned the room. "Frankly," she said, "most of you should be thanking Suncrest. They've paid well above market for every unit they've bought here, and that raises everyone's property values, whether you like their business model or not." The plan, with micro setback. I didn't want to fight this through a lawsuit against the HOA itself if a faster path existed, mostly because litigation against an association ultimately gets paid for out of the same assessment dollars every resident, including me, contributes each month. Arizona's HOA statute gave us two more direct tools instead: a homeowner petition process allowing a defined percentage of members to force termination of a management contract for breach of fiduciary duty, and a formal complaint to the state's Real Estate Regulatory Office, which oversees community association managers and can suspend or revoke a manager's certification for exactly this kind of undisclosed conflict. Harriet drafted the fiduciary breach petition, and Wallace Osgothorpe, to his credit, became its most effective advocate once he understood the full scope of what Beverly had done under his own board's nose. Wallace and I spent 3 weeks going door to door across the community's 512 units, something I hadn't done at this scale in 2 decades on the architectural committee, explaining the exemption scheme and the consulting fee pattern to residents who, like Wallace, had genuinely had no idea any of it was happening. One of those conversations stuck with me more than most. An original 1996 buyer named Corinne Van Tongeren, in her 80s, now and rarely leaving her casita except for water aerobics twice a week, listened to the whole explanation on her front porch, and then said, quietly, "My husband and I bought here because it was supposed to be a place where people knew each other and looked out for each other's homes. I don't recognize what this place has been turning into the last 2 years, and I didn't even know why until just now." She signed the petition before I'd finished folding up my clipboard. Here's the micro setback. Beverly's attorney sent a letter to the board arguing that the fiduciary breach petition, as drafted, didn't meet the statutory threshold because it targeted her personally rather than the management contract as a whole, a technical argument that threatened to delay the termination process by weeks while we redrafted the petition's language. Harriet redrafted it within days to properly target both the contract and Beverly's individual conduct as the contract's designated representative, but the delay meant Suncrest closed on 2 more units before the petition process could conclude, adding further pressure to move quickly. Climax. Going door to door across 512 units taught me things about this community I hadn't fully absorbed in 22 years of living here. I met residents I'd only ever waved to across the golf course, learned that at least 4 other households had quietly harbored their own suspicions about Beverly's dual role without ever having the specific evidence to act on it, and found, more than once, that simply explaining the bank statement pattern out loud to a neighbor on their own porch did more to convince them than any printed summary Harriet and I could have handed over. Wallace kept a tally on a yellow legal pad that grew steadily more dog-eared over 3 weeks. And by the second week of November, we'd cleared 400 signatures, well past the threshold, though we kept collecting through early December anyway, mostly because a wider margin would matter once it came time for an actual vote. We reached the statutory signature threshold in early December, with 71% of Desert Bloom Estates households signing the petition to terminate Beverly's management contract for breach of fiduciary duty, well above the 25% Arizona law required to force a special meeting on the matter. Simultaneously, Harriet filed the formal complaint with the state's Department of Real Estate against Beverly's Community Association Manager certification, attaching the bank statement pattern, the hearing officer's prior ruling on the exemption scheme, and sworn statements from Wallace Osgothorpe and 2 other longtime residents. The special meeting to vote on contract termination, held in the community clubhouse in mid-December, drew the largest turnout in the community's history, 289 households represented in person or by proxy, according to Wallace's own count at the door. Beverly attended with her attorney, who argued that terminating her contract mid-term would expose the association to breach of contract liability. Harriet's response, delivered calmly to the room, rather than as a legal argument aimed only at Beverly's counsel, focused the vote on what actually mattered: Arizona law explicitly allows termination for cause when a manager breaches fiduciary duty, she said. A manager who accepted secret payments, tied directly to the value of decisions she made on this community's behalf, isn't just a difficult employee, she's the textbook example this exact statute was written to address. Otis Fenley, a retired airline pilot who'd moved into the community only 2 years earlier, and had watched the entire dispute unfold with the specific outrage of someone who'd bought into what he thought was a stable, well-run neighborhood, stood up during public comment and said the thing that seemed to land hardest with the room. "I didn't retire out here to find out my HOA president was on a company's payroll the whole time she was telling us everything was fine," he said. "Whatever it costs to get her out, it's worth it." Fritz Camarillo spoke again near the end of public comment, quieter this time, addressing the room rather than Beverly directly. "I've lived here 19 years, he said. "I've never once gone to one of these meetings expecting drama. I came tonight because Louise knocked on my door and told me something I needed to hear. I'd rather have boring meetings and honest paperwork than whatever this has turned into." A number of people around him nodded, and I noticed, watching from near the front, that even a few residents who'd arrived undecided seemed to settle their own minds somewhere in that exact moment. Priscilla Nakamura spoke last, before the vote itself, and her comment was the quietest of the evening, but the one I found myself thinking about longest afterward. "I sat next to Beverly at budget meetings for 4 years, she said. "I trusted the numbers she gave me because that's what serving on a volunteer board together is supposed to mean. I'd rather we fix that trust properly, even if it costs us a difficult year finding new management, than keep pretending tonight didn't happen." Wallace told me afterward he thought her comment moved more undecided votes than anything Harriet or I had said all evening, precisely because it came from someone who'd been just as fooled as everyone else in the room. The vote to terminate Beverly's management contract passed 289-6. Mini Justice. The State Department of Real Estate's investigation, running in parallel over the following 4 months, ultimately suspended Beverly's Community Association manager certification for 18 months and imposed a civil penalty of $22,500 for the undisclosed conflict of interest, citing the same bank statement pattern Harriet had compiled. Suncrest Hospitality Group, once the exemption scheme collapsed and the community's new interim board formally rescinded every improperly granted rental exemption, quietly listed all 13 of its acquired units for sale within the following 2 months, several at a loss once the properties could no longer legally operate as nightly rentals. The interim board, with Wallace now serving as its acting president, sent a formal letter to the 11 households whose casitas had carried the improper exemption, most of whom were still Suncrest-owned at that point, giving 30 days to bring the units into compliance with Section 7.4, or face the same administrative enforcement process that had shut down the Merrow's operation. 9 of the 11 complied within the deadline. The remaining 2 became the subject of a second consolidated hearing before the state's Office of Administrative Hearings the following spring, which found in the community's favor on both, citing the original Osamuegi ruling as controlling precedent for how Section 7.4 applied, regardless of which entity happened to hold title. Trent and Ashley Merrow, notably, weren't part of Suncrest's portfolio. Theirs had been an independent purchase, but they sold their casita that spring anyway, citing, in a brief conversation with Desmond Faraday during his last service call there, that the whole community got too complicated for what we actually wanted out of it. I understood that to mean, in plainer terms, that a nightly rental business built on a fee that never had any legal standing had stopped being worth the fight the moment the fee's origin came apart in public. Otis Fenley, the dentist, the original one, from the shared parking court, not the retired pilot who'd later share his name at the December meeting, told me he'd started keeping his own copy of every board resolution the interim board issued from that point forward, filed in a drawer next to his old dental license, just in case anybody ever needs a second set of eyes on this again. I told him I hoped nobody ever would, though we both understood, I think, that hoping wasn't the same thing as a plan, and that his drawer of resolutions was worth more to this community than either of us wanted to admit out loud. Corinne Van Tongeren, the original 1996 buyer who signed my petition on her porch, sent me a card that winter that simply said, Thank you for remembering what this place was supposed to be. I've kept it taped inside my kitchen cabinet ever since, next to the grocery list pad, where I see it most mornings making coffee. Harriet Blodgett's final invoice for the whole engagement, from the original records request through the December vote, came to just under $14,000, split among the interim board's operating budget once the termination vote passed, which worked out to less than $30 per household across the community. Wallace made a point of putting that exact figure on the agenda at the next general meeting. Mostly, he told me privately afterward, because he wanted every resident who'd ever wondered whether the fight was worth the trouble to see the actual number next to what Beverly and Suncrest had extracted from the community instead. People sometimes ask whether one Airbnb 2 doors down was really connected to a scheme touching 13 units and a 6-figure consulting arrangement, or whether I got lucky pulling that thread. I don't think it was luck, and I don't think the two things were ever as separate as they first looked. Both depended on the same quiet bet, that a community of retirees, aging homeowners, and part-time residents wouldn't have the patience or the standing to actually follow a paper trail all the way to where it led. The question underneath all of it was never really about one nightly rental. It was about whether 512 households could keep deciding, together, what kind of community this actually was. Quiet, residential, governed by rules everyone agreed to when they bought in, or whether that decision would quietly transfer, one unlawful exemption fee at a time, to whichever company figured out how to buy the person holding the keys. Mitchell asked me, on one of our Sunday calls not long after the vote, whether I regretted spending most of a year on something that started with a single noisy Airbnb. I told him the honest answer, no, though I hadn't expected, at 66, to spend a year of my retirement reading bank statements and knocking on 500 doors instead of finally learning pickleball. He laughed and told me that sounded exactly like something his father would have found a way to be proud of, which is about as good a thing as anyone said to me since Gerald passed. I think about Beverly Colquitt more than I expected to, honestly, in the months since all of this resolved. 6 years is a long time to serve a community well, before betraying it, and I don't think she started out intending any of this. Wallace's theory, which I've come to mostly agree with, is that the first Suncrest exemption probably felt like a small, defensible favor for a single frustrated buyer, the kind of accommodation any community manager makes dozens of times a year, and that each subsequent one simply became easier to justify than admitting the first one had been wrong. I don't offer that as an excuse. I offer it because I think it's the more useful lesson than simply calling her greedy and moving on. Since the version of this story where somebody sets out from day one to defraud an entire community is a much rarer thing than the version where somebody drifts into it, one convenient exception at a time. The shared parking court behind my house holds 4 cars again most nights, same as it did for the 18 years before the Merrows moved in. Hazel Prentice's old casita sold again that spring, to a young family with 2 kids who used the shared court exactly the way it was designed for, and I brought them the same welcome I've brought every new neighbor for 2 decades, including, admittedly, the Merrows. Desert Bloom Estates hired an outside, professionally licensed management firm the following spring, one with no resident board members holding dual roles of any kind, a structural change Wallace Osgathorpe pushed through as one of his final acts before rotating off the board himself. Wallace still stops by most mornings when I'm out walking the Loop Road, and he's taken to reading every single board packet line by line now, a habit he says he wishes he'd started 6 years earlier. Fritz Camarillo joined the architectural committee alongside me that same spring, the first new volunteer we'd had in almost 4 years, and he's turned out to have a surprisingly sharp eye for reading fine print in vendor contracts, a skill he says he picked up doing his own family's small business accounting for 3 decades before he retired. I've started handing him the drier financial disclosures at every meeting now, mostly because he catches things I'd have skimmed past a decade ago, and it's been genuinely nice having someone else at that table who reads a contract the way I always have. Priscilla Nakamura took over the board's finance committee once the new management firm came aboard, and one of her first changes was requiring every vendor agreement above a modest threshold to be posted in full, appendices included, in the residents-only section of the community website, rather than simply summarized in a board packet. Nobody should have to be a retired records examiner to know what their own HOA signed, she told me over coffee not long after the change took effect, which struck me as about as plain a description of the whole problem as anyone had managed to offer. The community newsletter runs a quarterly governance update now, a section that didn't exist before all of this, summarizing every board financial decision in plain language, rather than the dense legal phrasing Beverly's office used to favor. I can't take full credit for that change, though I did suggest it at the same meeting where Wallace announced the new management firm, mostly because I'd come to believe, after 11 weeks of chasing down a single exemption, that the real failure here was never any one person's greed. It was how easy this community had made it, over years of comfortable inattention, for that greed to go unnoticed. I didn't do any of this out of anger at Trent and Ashley Merrow, or even really at Beverly Colquitt, though I won't pretend her betrayal of a community that trusted her for 6 years doesn't still sting when I think about it. I did it because Section 7.4 was written into this community's recorded CC&Rs in 1998 by people who wanted this to stay a place where neighbors actually knew each other, and because Wallace Osgathorpe and Corinne Van Tongeren and Otis Fenley and 90 strangers in a clubhouse were willing, once somebody showed them what was actually happening, to stand up and say it mattered. Turns out that's most of what keeping a community actually requires. Somebody willing to keep asking for the paperwork, and enough neighbors willing, when it matters, to show up and read it. This video is a dramatized storytelling narrative based on real-life themes and HOA/property regulations. Names, characters, and specific locations are fictional or have been changed for privacy. Visuals are generated using AI tools for illustrative purposes only. This content is for entertainment purposes and does not constitute legal advice. If a new neighbor moved in tomorrow claiming a special exemption to a rule everyone else follows, would you know how to find out whether that exemption is actually real?